Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on neurodiversity. My name is Oliver Lack. I'm a children's wellbeing practitioner from the Waltham Forest Mental Health Support Team, and I'm going to be delivering this session over the next hour or so, around about an hour. So my role typically is to work in schools with my team to deliver low intensity mental health intervention. So that might be for things such as anxiety or low mood. And we do kind of, in addition to this one-to-one work that we often do, so we also deliver kind of psychoeducation workshops. And these workshops provide information and advice and guidance on a number of topics. So what we're doing, this webinar, I guess, is part of our work on psychoeducation. And today I'm going to be talking about neurodiversity. And hopefully throughout the session, you'll have a greater understanding of things related to neurodiversity by the end. Before I begin, though, I should just give thanks to some previous colleagues from Great Ormond Street, who kind of there's a metaphor I use at one point in this slides, and some of the ideas as well used in these slides were kind of partly generated when I was working in the TIC service on a placement at Great Ormond Street Hospital. So thank you to everyone who works there, and also my fantastic team for all the amazing work they do. Before we continue, I also just have to give you this disclaimer that this video is for informational purposes only, and obviously please follow the advice of any relevant professionals involved in yours or your child's care. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, please contact 111. But if you feel the crisis is an emergency where you're worried about yours or someone else's immediate safety, call emergency services on 999, or you can go to your local A&E department. There are a number of other things that are available to support with your mental health, and you can access free listening services that may be able to help you. So you can call Samaritans on 116 123, or you can text Shout, and the number to text is there as well. And if you're under the age of 19, you can call Childline on 0800 1111. So the numbers are all there, and that's just a quick disclaimer to keep in mind. So what is this session going to cover? I guess there are three main parts. The first is looking at or answering the question, what is neurodiversity? The second part is thinking about the language of neurodiversity. What does that mean? And then the kind of third and final part looks at different forms of neurodivergence and their associated strengths. So we'll cover all of that today. That's the aim of the kind of session. So I guess we'll start at the very beginning by answering the question, what is neurodiversity? So I think we'll take this definition from Nick Walker, who says that neurodiversity is the diversity of human minds, the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. And I think what that really means is that every single person on this planet has a different brain and a different kind of brain type, so the way it's structured is slightly different, but also in the way that we think, in the way that we experience the world around us. That's completely different from the person who's next to us. And because every single person on this planet is different in these aspects, that is neurodiversity. So having lots of different brain types is actually a strength. So having kind of a world filled with different ways of thinking can be beneficial. And one way we can see the benefits of diversity is to look at kind of other types of neurodiversity. So let's take, for example, biodiversity. So let's imagine we're in a hot country maybe, and there's a small bee who goes along to a plant to get some pollen. And that bee then goes to another flower or tree and kind of pollinates that plant, and then it kind of grows up into another strong plant that actually serves as food for some, let's say, a group of elephants. And those group of elephants come along and they eat some leaves from this new shrub or tree, whatever the plant is. And in doing so, let's say they over time create a path that gives access to a watering hole, which allows for other animals such as, I don't know, giraffes or deer to come to this watering hole and feed and kind of survive from drinking water. And maybe they also have other food there as well. And it's only because each of the creatures that I've just mentioned, whether they're a small bee or the big elephant, has a completely different kind of behavior, but also a different job, I guess, if you want to think of it like that, in the natural world. And because we have all these animals that are completely different in their shape and size and the way they behave, we're able to create this beautiful natural world. So I don't know if you're imagining watching maybe a David Attenborough documentary or a natural kind of a nature TV program, you can see the amazing natural world that we have because of all that kind of diversity. So another way that we could look at this is, let's say you're going out and collecting some rocks. You're really passionate about collecting rocks. I can imagine that a rock collector maybe would want to collect lots of different rocks of different shapes and sizes, as having rocks that are kind of different colors and, like I've already said, different shapes and sizes makes a rock collection possibly much more beautiful and exciting than maybe just collecting, say, all the same kind of rocks on a beach. And even if someone did want to go and collect one specific type of rock, they would probably want to find variation or diversity within that kind of species or type of rock, I guess. So actually having things that are really different and having diversity in any shape or form is a strength. And when we think about our brain types, it's having this kind of difference among us that makes the world fantastic. And having different types of ideas can lead to productivity and creativity. And it can lead to better work. It can lead to kind of more interesting discussions among individuals. And I think that's what makes the world a more beautiful and exciting place and why we need different types of brains. So as we can already see, we're starting the webinar with a focus on strengths. But I do think it's important to caveat this and say that strengths and talking about the strengths that are associated with different brain types does not diminish disability or the difficulties neurodivergent individuals face in their daily lives. And it's important to bear that in mind. I'm not saying that it's easy to be neurodivergent, but what I am saying is we need to reframe the way we think about having a different way of thinking or a different kind of way we perceive the world, and also focus on strengths rather than only focusing on difficulties, though we are not ignoring them. So when we talk about neurodiversity, there's also a language that is associated with neurodiversity. So I've already explained what neurodiversity is, but an individual themselves cannot be neurodiverse. And I think sometimes there is a bit of confusion around the word and how it's used. And even sometimes you hear colleagues say, oh, I'm working with a neurodiverse person, or there's a new paper or some new research on neurodiverse people. But actually, that doesn't really make sense, because diversity can only exist with a group or a collective or a number of people. So an individual themselves cannot be neurodiverse. So if an individual has, for example, a neurological condition or a difference in their brain, then we call this neurodivergence. And the definition of this, or being neurodivergent, means having a mind that functions in a way in ways which diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards of normal. So that definition is again from Nick Walker. And one way of explaining this is by using this kind of graph, and it looks a little bit like a hill. But what the line that kind of represents the hill shows is kind of the number of people. So the higher the line is at the top here, let me just get a laser pointer to help explain. But you can probably see it around the top here, the top of the hill, there are a greater number of people. So we know that there are a greater number of people who kind of think and behave in a similar way, and we would call these people neurotypical. So there are a greater number of people with a certain number of traits in the general population. And as we slowly move down the line, and we come to here, we find that people may think or behave in a slightly different way, and there are typically less people who have, for example, autistic traits or ADHD traits, and we would say that these people are neurodivergent, and hopefully that explains a little bit more the definition that Nick Walker gave us. So there are multiple forms of neurodivergence, so people who think and behave differently from the majority of the population, and these fall under what we would call the umbrella of neurodivergent conditions. So these include things such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, so these things are typically associated with difficulties reading and maybe with numbers. And then we've got ADHD, what used to be called or is sometimes called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We've got Tourette syndrome, and then we've got dyspraxia or developmental coordination disorder, but I think we'll talk about the use of the word disorder and why that can be harmful later on. We've also got autism, and then we've got something called acquired neurodivergence. So many people who are neurodivergent, who may have a neurodivergent condition, may also have a co-occurring form of neurodivergence. So an autistic person may also be ADHD, or a Tourette, someone with Tourette's may also have dyslexia or ADHD. And it's important to keep that in mind, that often neurodivergence co-occurs with other forms of neurodivergence. It says on the right-hand side of the screen here, acquired neurodivergence. And acquired neurodivergence is something that happens later in life or is acquired after birth. So typically neurodivergent conditions are from birth, but let's say someone could experience a brain injury, or maybe they might have a stroke or something similar to that, and that would be something what we would call acquired neurodivergence. Things like dementia and Parkinson's may also be included under the kind of scope of acquired neurodivergence as well. The definition of acquired neurodivergence is also starting to include more things. So some people are starting to also include PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and things like OCD as well. So because we know that there can be differences in people's brains when they experience, for example, OCD is associated with different kind of brain pathways. But that's maybe if you're interested in that, you can look up some more kind of research about that on the internet. So the first form of neurodivergence that we'll start with is autism. So before I explain some of the kind of signs or traits of autism, what I will do is just talk a little bit about the language that we use when we talk about autism. And I've already said language is important. But what we know is that actually autistic people have a preference for the language that they would like to use when describing autism. And historically, the language used around autism has been very stigmatizing. And one of the ways that autism used to be described is an autistic person used to be called a person with autism. And I don't know if you can see on the left-hand side of this screen, it says here there's a picture from a survey by an autistic advocate called Chris Bonello, who also is a teacher. And he does a survey kind of every few years where he gets non-autistic people and autistic people to kind of rate their preferences for how the language used to describe autism. And they had quite a large number of people. So if you look at that, we've got 11,212 individuals took part. And what autistic people said was that they had a preference for identity first language. And identity first language puts autism at the heart of someone's identity. So, for example, an autistic person doesn't carry around autism around with them. So we have something called person first language, which would be a person with autism. Throughout this talk, I will be using the term autistic person, and an example of why kind of the neural explanation of this is this good cartoon here, which shows, I've already briefly mentioned this, but yeah, it's not like someone gets their autism out of their backpack and then kind of experiences it suddenly and then puts it away again, and it only appears when things are difficult. An autistic person experiences the world around them every day as an autistic person. So it's kind of all their senses and all the information that is processed, and they process that information as an autistic person. So I'll be using the language that is preferred by autistic people when talking about autism. But this isn't just found to be a preference in kind of research, survey research. We've also found in scientific research studies as well that this is also the preference for autistic people. So I think it's important that if we are talking about autistic people, we use the terminology they prefer, and it's also less stigmatizing as well. So that is the terminology I'll be using, autistic person, throughout the presentation. There's also some kind of research that's come out as well with language that has also been used, which is kind of stigmatizing, and I'll briefly just talk about some of the other language as well. So, for example, sometimes people used to say that someone is severely autistic, or an autistic person is high or low functioning. But actually this can be stigmatizing in itself, because what does high or low functioning mean? What does severely autistic mean? And actually, we know that functioning can change based on context, right? So a person could be on the train and they could find it really overwhelming, and suddenly they feel unable to function. And then maybe they're at home doing their favorite thing and they feel completely able to function. So that label in itself doesn't really mean anything, and is stigmatizing, because obviously an individual's needs can change quite considerably. And then also, severity isn't a very helpful label, and instead it's maybe suggested now of moving towards words such as high or low support needs, and actually defining exactly what someone's needs are, while also acknowledging their strengths. So maybe someone has a support need where they find kind of talking to other individuals in an enclosed space really difficult. That might be an area where they have kind of high support needs, and how can we support an individual in that way? This is from, this picture on the slide is from a research paper which was originally developed for language for researchers to think about, but I also think it's helpful as parents or carers, and even autistic people and non-autistic people ourselves, to update our language and use this language as well. And there's a few other words that previously were used associated with autism that I'll update. So we've got here special interests, so instead I'll try and use areas of interest. And then we've also got things like, instead of saying autism symptoms, I'll use autism traits, as these are all kind of language that is less ableist and what is kind of almost discriminatory towards autistic people. So I think it's really important that even after today, the language I use may over time become outdated. So if possible, that we just make sure we follow autistic people's preferences, but also kind of update ourselves, whether that's research online or kind of reading material, anything to kind of stay up to date with current preferences. The thing I should say is sometimes an autistic person may have a preference for person first language. They may want to say, I'm a person with autism, or they may want to say that they have severe autism, or they may want to use any of the languages, and it's up to that person themselves to choose the language that they prefer. And as non-autistic people, it's kind of important that that choice is respected. So it's down to the individual in terms of what language they want to use, and it should be respected. But on the whole, if we're talking about autistic people, we should use language that is generally where there's a consensus as to the preference, to be less stigmatizing and supportive of autistic people. In terms of the signs of autism, there are a few signs that are kind of that we might commonly see, and I'll describe some of those signs in a sec. But we know that roughly 1 in 100 people are autistic. So many of you have probably met an autistic person. You may live with an autistic person, or you may be autistic yourself. And we often know that autistic people have siblings or relatives who are autistic. So maybe you have a child who's autistic, but you are also autistic yourself, and you may have other family members or grandparents who are autistic. Autistic people often kind of perceive and experience the world differently from neurotypical people. So this can include the way we experience sensory information. So for example, an autistic person can have what we would call hypersensory kind of arousal or sensory sensitivity. And so that might be something like if we're on a tube and it's really overwhelming, the noise of people talking around us. It could be the lighting of, I don't know, some hospital settings have really bright neon lighting, which can be really unpleasant. It might be that the food that someone eats is really kind of strong, or the smells that they can smell in the environment around them are really overwhelming. And the experience of this information can make someone's brain feel like it's being bombarded with information. And really, really difficult, particularly if it happens a lot. It can lead to kind of overwhelm and burnout as well if it's continually happening. And then there's also hyposensory sensitivity, and that might mean an autistic person really wants to seek out sensory information. They may not feel like they're receiving enough. So some autistic people might really like pressure, and some autistic people really like hugs or kind of weighted blankets, or they may kind of really like having soothing kind of tactile stimulation like paintbrushes on their hand or skin, because it provides some kind of tactile or touch sensory information, which can be really helpful for some people. So every autistic person may have a different sensory profile, and it's important to consider that. And an autistic person may have kind of a hypo sensory sensitivity as well as a hyper one, and they can have both, and it can just be for different senses that they may have a hyper or a hypo sensory sensitivity. But it's really important that as carers or parents or professionals, we really consider what may be affecting an autistic person. Is it the sound of me banging the saucepan in the kitchen? Is it that tube journey on the way to school? Is it the sound in the car that's really upsetting someone? Is it are we talking too loudly? Is the TV on really loud? Think about all the different things that may be upsetting or difficult for an autistic person in terms of their senses, and that can be really beneficial. Autistic people often have strong interests or things or areas of interest. So these can vary considerably from person to person, and they can also, historically there was some kind of gender stereotypes about what people's interests might be, but we know that actually there are kind of no kind of specific things that an autistic person might be interested. One person might be really interested in trains, another might be really interested in their favorite band, or for example, musical theatre, or a specific crime novel. There's anything that a person might be really interested in, and it can often become a really big passion for that person. So some autistic people, I'll use my own example, but I really like, for example, I've already said musical theatre, but I love researching musical theatre and looking up who's the director of a musical, when it was first staged, if the songs in that musical are different from the kind of recording they have of it than when it was first put on. So it's really different for every single person, their interest. And just because, for example, a girl is interested in a band, and doesn't mean just because it's a band that it's not an area of interest. So I don't think we should ever deny people's area of interest, and we should support autistic people and allow them to flourish with their interests and be able to talk about it, because they're often really interesting and exciting things. Autistic people often have differences in their communication style, and sometimes this can be interpreted by non-autistic people as autistic people being rude. Sometimes the autistic people's communication style can be direct, and actually we'll talk about differences in communication in a sec, but maybe that's a strength, cutting through excess messages and really getting to the point. But also sometimes irony and jokes might be perceived in a different way. So, for example, the example I think people often use is, and I think this is a frequently used one, but sometimes, for example, it's raining cats and dogs can sometimes be confusing, right? Because an autistic person might think, oh, it's actually raining cats and dogs. So sometimes ironic humor or kind of sarcasm can be confusing for autistic people, but also autistic people can be sarcastic themselves. Again, it just really depends on the person, but autistic people typically communicate in a slightly different way in the style that they communicate. And autistic people also have differences in the way they kind of form social relationships. So some autistic people might not seek social relationships that often. They may want a few friends, but not many, or they may want to kind of mainly do their own thing. Social relationships can be quite overwhelming, but some autistic people really want to make friends and seek out social relationships, but sometimes these can be difficult, as sometimes bullying is more common, sadly, for autistic people, as non-autistic people can be quite hurtful and unkind sometimes to autistic people. But also sometimes it may be difficult to kind of start conversations, and there may be anxiety, particularly as there is a lot of stigma directed towards autistic people. So kind of social relationships can be difficult sometimes for autistic people, but that doesn't mean that they're not always wanted. Autistic people also may do something called stimming, which can involve kind of movement, such as like, let's say, flapping one's arms or jumping up and down, or some people might make sounds or rock backwards and forwards or kind of twirl things, twirl their hair. Sometimes people can even do things like repeat phrases in their head, and these things are what we call stimming. So they're motor movements or sounds that help a person kind of actually regulate themselves. So stimming is a way of calming oneself down. So let's say I was rocking backwards and forwards. Someone in the street who's not autistic might question why I'm doing this. And sometimes teachers or parents can tell their children not to kind of stim, but actually stimming can be a really helpful thing that allows someone to kind of calm down and regulate themselves. So it's important that we keep that in mind as well. And I've written here that autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, and we've touched on this briefly, but that means that autism is present normally throughout someone's life and from birth. Some people might be diagnosed later in life or only realize they're autistic when they're older, but it's likely they've been autistic since they were born, since they were an infant. And then autism is currently classified as a disability, and I put a star next to this as I view autism, and there's a greater consensus now of viewing autism in terms of the social, or all disabilities in terms of the social model of disability. And actually, there's nothing inherently wrong with the word disability, but disability may arise by society not being built for disabled people. So we're not saying that disabled people don't have differences. So, for example, autistic people do have different brains, but the way society is structured isn't supportive or designed for autistic people. So let's say we think about workspaces, for example. Lots of workspaces are busy and open plan and in an office, and you've got really bright lights and it's really loud. That's not going to be conducive to someone who's got sensory hypersensory sensitivities, who finds all these things really difficult. And those kind of things can be disabling, meaning someone isn't able to do, for example, a task they might need to do. So that's kind of the way that we view disability. But I really think it's important that we don't shy away from the term disability, as it doesn't mean that something is bad. It just means often that someone is unable to do something because of the environment around them. So it's really important that we think of how we can support disabled people to be able to do the things they want to do. And I've also important to highlight is that some autistic people are non-speaking, and what that means is they may communicate by other means. So that can be using alternative communication devices. So some autistic people might use pictures or shapes or kind of their iPad or an alternative software to communicate. And some autistic people will use speech and language. It's really dependent on every autistic person being different and their own individual. But just because someone doesn't speak or is non-speaking doesn't mean they don't communicate or that they're not understanding. It just may mean that they've got a different way of communicating with us. So it's important that we kind of think about that and as well. And finally, just something to be aware of is that because of the way the world is structured, it can be quite distressing to experience lots of sensory sensitivities. It can be distressing to experience stigma or live in a world that isn't designed for you. So it makes sense that anxiety and depression are more common in autistic people. And I think it's important that parents do consider that this might be something that is more likely to be experienced by autistic people, and just to be aware of that. This is just to make you aware that the NHS website has a list of kind of signs or traits of autism if you're more interested in thinking about kind of or questioning whether you or your child might be autistic. So it might be helpful to have a look there in the first instance, but there are also a range of kind of resources I'll demonstrate later in the presentation that could also be helpful to check out. I'll do signposting at the end. I've put this slide here because I want to talk to you a little bit about autistic communication. I've already talked about it a little bit already, but I think there's some exciting new ways of thinking about it that are starting to emerge. And this picture is from something called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which is developed in America and is the criteria they used for any psychiatric diagnosis. So if you go and see a psychiatric doctor, or let's say maybe even a psychologist or psychiatric nurse, and let's say someone was providing a diagnosis, they would use this book to make that diagnosis. So this is the criteria that is used by these people for autism. And the language that's used is not very nice, and I've highlighted some of it. So it says things like deficits in social communication, social interaction, social emotional reciprocity, failure of normal back and forth conversation, failure to initiate and respond to social interactions, deficits in non-verbal communication behaviors, abnormalities in eye contact and body language or deficits, and severity is based on symptom communication impairments, really horrible things. And I think if anyone was described as being failing in something or having a deficit, I think they would be quite upset. But actually what we know or start to know from research is that autistic people can actually communicate quite well. So this was a paper done at Edinburgh University by a research group there. And this paper looked at kind of the way autistic people communicate with one another and how non-autistic people communicate and how autistic people and non-autistic people communicate. So this is a diagram from this fantastic research. So the top, let me get my laser pointer out again. So the top row of people in the green are autistic people. And what they did in this experiment is they gave, I don't know if anyone used to play that game of Whispers or kind of pass the message along at school, but they got each group, so we've got the autistic group in green here at the top, the non-autistic group here in the red, and then the blue group box at the bottom, you've got the mixed group who are autistic and non-autistic people. And they had to pass a message along in each group. And so I think it was, if I remember correctly, a story about a bear going on an adventure. And then they've got the N person, so the person here who's called person H has to relay that information back to the researcher. So the researcher has to kind of find out how many details they could pass along and how accurately they could report the story. When they looked at kind of the autistic group by themselves, they found that the kind of ability to communicate the information was as accurate or just as good as the non-autistic group. So there was no difference between the groups in their ability to accurately convey the information. The only difference when there was a decrease in accuracy or there was less accuracy in the message being kind of passed along is in the mixed group with autistic and non-autistic people. And what they found was that the kind of communication or the rate at which the story was able to be recalled kind of decreased much more quickly, and there were a greater number of inaccurate details recalled. So actually, this kind of highlights something that is called the double empathy problem. And the double empathy problem was developed by someone called Damien Milton, and it suggests that actually autistic people and non-autistic people, it may not be that autistic people are bad at communicating, it might just be a mismatch between autistic people and non-autistic people's communication styles. And historically, autistic people have changed the way they communicate quite frequently to accommodate the non-autistic people and make it easier for them to communicate with autistic people. But actually, what I think is important to highlight is that both non-autistic people and autistic people, it's both of their jobs when interacting to kind of think about how they communicate. And it's really important that non-autistic people think about this, as historically, as I've said, they haven't done so much. Historically, we've seen that in that criteria, autistic communication was viewed as deficit or bad or negative, but actually what this research is showing is it may just be a different way of communicating, which I think as a parent or a carer or an autistic person is really important to know. And I think we need to think about how we adapt our communication as well. So let's move on to thinking about autistic strengths. So we know that autistic people can have enhanced perceptual abilities. So these can include things like the ability to detect different frequencies. So that means like the difference between two notes. It may also be able to kind of hear different chords and be able to detect the difference in sounds between two chords. Those kind of things can what we call auditory perception in science. So that can be a benefit for autistic people. Or strength, sorry. I think we also know that autistic people can have enhanced creativity. And what the example I'm going to talk about now is someone called Temple Grandin. So if you can see on the slide, there's kind of an arrow which points down to a lady who I mentioned is called Temple Grandin, and what she did as an autistic advocate is she's written many books about being autistic, but she's also had the amazing ability to think differently. And she went into cattle sheds in America, and she was able to work out why cows were becoming stressed when they went into a cow shed. And she was able to adapt their environment to make it less stressful for them, purely because she was able to see the world and really focus on kind of details and kind of small aspects of the environment that no one else had noticed. And because she was able to see those kind of things that no one else was picking up on and see the world differently, she was able to do something fantastic for animal welfare, which I think is an amazing thing to do. There's also a suggestion that autistic people are more open-minded and honest, and being more honest is really beneficial in multiple settings, particularly as even in the workplace. I've got here, there's a study that shows autistic people have greater attention to detail, but if you're working with someone who's more open-minded and honest, surely that's a helpful thing, and you're much more likely to understand things from a clearer perspective. I'll talk about kind of the bottom bit here, this thing where it says 2020. And I think having an attention to detail, we've already talked about Temple Grandin success, but if you can spot things that no one else can, or you can really focus on small, minute things and really hone in on them and make them stronger, that's a fantastic thing to be able to do. Again, being able to do things that are repetitive can be really beneficial in a workplace, or kind of having an above standard work ethic, which I also think comes back to being more open-minded and honest, and liking kind of learning is another strength that's been associated with autistic people. That's one thing I want to mention was that there was a study done in 2015, and they find that autistic people had a greater number of special talents. And I think they found out of 254 kind of people, autistic people, 62.6% of them had a special isolated skill, and this varied from memory abilities to musical talents. But that's a majority of these autistic people having a special isolated skill or talent, which I think historically people have had a very negative view, and I think it's great that we're starting to see research which shows and celebrates the talents that autistic people have. And there are many more than the ones I've listed here. This is just, normally at this point I would pause and show a video, but you're probably watching this on YouTube, so for copyright issues I won't show you this video, but I definitely recommend watching it. It's called Amazing Things Happen by Alexander Amelines, and you can just type it into Google and it should come up, but I've also got the link here on the slide, and I believe the link should also be in the description of this video. So I definitely recommend going to watch that. I'll just if you want to do that now, I would recommend pausing for a second and then coming back. So I will just stop speaking very briefly to give you the chance to press pause, and then I'll begin again. Okay, I hope if you have just rejoined us after pausing to watch that video that you enjoyed it. I think it's a great animation, and it was award-winning when it came out, and I definitely think it's important at highlighting strengths, and it's just a great video. Okay, so now we're moving on to think about ADHD. So let's have a look at this. So ADHD is slightly more common, we know, than autism, so we see it in around 3 to 5% of people. And ADHD is typically characterized by differences in attention. So it could be that someone's attention moves around slightly more quickly, and this can sometimes make concentrating more difficult, or harder to concentrate. But we also know that things like ADHD people can often feel like they have a kind of a motor inside them, or a need to move about, and so kind of they might fidget more, or move their leg up and down if they're sitting still, or they might kind of get up from a task they're doing and move about. Maybe in a classroom it's someone who might not sit still at their desk. It could be in a meeting, someone who is spinning around in their chair or standing up and looking around. It might be someone who easily loses items. ADHD people, like myself, often find it hard. I find it hard to get out of the door in the morning, and I might find it difficult to locate items that I had yesterday, or find out where I've put something in my bag. I can't remember exactly where it is. And it's often because I wasn't paying enough attention when I put that thing in my bag. It may be difficult to carry out a task because, as I've said, having an attention style that kind of moves around a lot can make it hard to stick with one task and continue it, particularly if the task is not something that we enjoy or is boring. And I think some kind of homeworks can definitely be like that, or even work tasks, certainly. So someone may want to kind of change a task, or want to do 2 tasks at the same time. I know some ADHD people are able to kind of switch between a task, or kind of have something playing in the background to maintain their attention to the task that they're doing. ADHD people also can sometimes interrupt other people as they get excited about what they want to talk about, and they may like talking a lot about something they're passionate about, and autistic people are also similar in that respect. And then finally, just something that is important to highlight is that ADHD people can often be stigmatized in school, particularly by teachers and school staff, and there's research evidence to show this. And I'm not blaming teachers in any way. I know teachers have lots of pressures and demands that they need to meet, but I think it's important that I highlight this. And it just, if you're a professional watching this, just that you think about, being kind to the people that you work with, and think about how you can really support someone to allow them to flourish. So let's think about strengths as well. Now we've thought about strengths for autism. What are the strengths associated with ADHD? So we know that from some research, people with ADHD have enhanced creativity. And I think there was this research, some researchers did a study and they found that in a competition, ADHD people were able to come up with more creative ideas when they were under pressure, and had to come up they might have won a prize if they came up with more ideas. We also know that actually being able to move your attention around, you might be able to spot other things that people don't see. And surely that's a strength if you can see things that others miss. There's something called hyperfocus that's associated with ADHD, and that can actually be the ability to really, if you're interested in something, spend a long time looking at it. Sometimes to the point where someone might not eat or drink as they're so focused on a task. And obviously we want people to look after their own health and well-being, but obviously if you're really engrossed, let's say you're writing a piece of music, or you're doing something you really love and you're able to do it for a long period of time, maybe you're able to produce something fantastic. So hyperfocus can be a really beneficial thing. Also, who doesn't want more energy? If you have more energy as an ADHD person, that's probably a beneficial thing. And actually, there's a good book that I'll talk to you later on in the presentation. I think it's called Neurodiversity, and it's by someone called Thomas Armstrong. But he suggests that ADHD might be an evolutionary advantage. And I think there's a reason why that might be, as historically, if you're the person who can spot threats and your attention's roaming around, then maybe you're probably more likely to survive than the person who's just ignoring the environment around them. But in addition to having an ADHD person, you probably need someone who's focused on one thing and whose attention isn't diverted around. So you need both people, an ADHD person and a non-ADHD person. But just because you have, I think, not having a different way of thinking doesn't mean it's just you. So I'm losing my words. Just because someone has a different way of thinking and seeing the world, it may be beneficial historically and mean people survive for longer. And just because you had someone who was thinking differently didn't mean it was a bad thing. Got there in the end, I think. In terms of this, someone called Charabin looked at ADHD people and compared ADHD students and ADHD students and non-ADHD students in terms of their strengths, and they found that it was only in a classroom setting that ADHD students found that they had less strengths. So actually, they both had the same number of strengths, but it was within a classroom setting that the ADHD students found theirs disappeared. So maybe it can maybe the environment that may be stopping someone being able to flourish. So if we go back to that social model of disability, maybe it's that setting that's really difficult for ADHD people. How can we make it so someone can focus more? Do they need rest breaks? Do they need fidget toys? Do they need things to help support their attention? And those are important things to think about. And then obviously ADHD people have been found to be more curious and adventurous, as well as being brave and courageous, all attributes that are really beneficial. And as we've been going for quite a long time, I think this is a period where it might be helpful to have a rest break, thinking of our own attention. So again, I will pause briefly to let you go and get a cup of tea. I won't pause for very long, but I'll just give you enough time to hit the pause button and go and make yourself a nice warm drink. and then we'll come back and look at dyslexia. Okay. Right, so if you are rejoining us, I hope you had time to get a nice hot beverage and relax for a bit. Thank you for coming back. I value you being able to share this information with you. What I'm going to talk to you about next is dyslexia. We know that around 1 in 10 children are dyslexic and have kind of typically difficulties with reading and spelling. So that's one of the main characteristics of dyslexia. But we also know some dyslexic people might have difficulties with keeping time or being able to read the time. So that can be telling like where a clock hand is on a clock, but it can also be kind of keeping track of time. So there's something called time blindness, which is often quite common across neurodivergence, actually. But it could also be sometimes dyslexic people have difficulty sometimes processing information, so they may have a slower processing speed. So things like instructions may be needed to be repeated a few times. It could also may make remembering lots of instructions difficult, particularly if it takes longer to process the information. So it's helpful to say something and sometimes give someone a bit of time to process that information. Additionally, directions can sometimes be difficult for dyslexic people, you know, telling your left from your right, and also numeracy, so being able to calculate things and sums. And as we saw earlier, dyscalculia is also another form of neurodivergence, but dyscalculia can exist without difficulties with reading and spelling and some of the features of dyslexia. So it's actually a distinct form of neurodivergence, but there can be an overlap, I guess, in that area. And again, it's important to say that in school settings, again, quite understandably, dyslexic people can experience lower self-esteem and high levels of anxiety. Particularly, for example, if you've got to read out loud in class, or if you're struggling in class. A lot of dyslexic people don't feel comfortable sharing that they're struggling, so maybe struggling silently with their schoolwork or feeling that they're behind, and that can feel embarrassing as well. So it's important to make sure that people in school or even at home are supported, so they are able, as I've already mentioned, with all the forms of neurodivergence, to flourish. Yeah. In terms of strengths, dyslexic people are often better at kind of seeing the whole picture. And in research, or what we call cognitive neuroscience, this is called spatial reasoning. So this typically means being able to look at a shape or a kind of a figure, or let's say we had lots of different blocks, and being able to rotate them around, and sometimes you only see part of the shape, and you're able to kind of work out what it would look like with only part of it existing. And there's a task called invisible figures, where you have lots of lines or shapes, and you have to work out whether they can exist in the real 3D world. And people who have kind of dyslexia are much better at accurately predicting whether a shape can really exist in the 3D world, which I think is very impressive. And if you can see the whole picture, maybe you can see something more creatively if you can walk around a problem. And we also know that a higher proportion of entrepreneurs are dyslexic, and we'll see some famous entrepreneurs coming up later on in the presentation when we look at famous neurodivergent people. So this is what I'm now going to talk about as kind of the final form of neurodivergence I can fit into this presentation. There are obviously many more, but I don't think I could fit every single one into roughly around about an hour or an hour and 15-minute presentation. So I'm going to talk to you about tics and Tourette's. So what we know is that around kind of 0.5% of people have Tourette syndrome, and Tourette syndrome is typically characterized by motor or vocal tics that last for more than a year, and it's typically observed before the age of 18, so during childhood and adolescence. And motor tics are things such as eye blinking, nose scrunching, kind of coughing, head jerk, no, sorry, not coughing, but kind of making kind of movements with your head or neck. I think I think there's a spelling mistake on my slides. I apologize. Maybe it's meant to say crouching. But anything where someone kind of may flick their arm out, or they kind of may move their head to one side, any of those kind of things may be motor tics. And you can have things that are complex motor tics, so it may be a sequence of movements, such as kind of, rather than, let's say, scrunching your nose, it could be scrunching your nose and blinking your eyes, or kind of a more directed jerk, like I said, throwing out your arm or looking like you're throwing a ball, any of those kind of things. And then we've also got vocal tics, and you can have, again, simple and complex vocal tics. But so simple vocal tics might include kind of grunting or breathing, kind of breath sounds through the nose or the mouth, those kind of things. And then we've got more complex vocal tics, such as sentences or lots of different words. But typically we know if something's a complex tic if it involves multiple kind of motor muscles. So for example, to form a sentence, you typically have to use kind of motor groups. And similarly for motor tics, you're using multiple kind of parts of your body or multiple muscles. So it kind of involves a complex sequence is the way that we can work out it's a complex tic, whereas a simple tic is normally something that's short and like a grunt or a breathing out or just one single eye blink, if that makes sense. There is a bit of a misconception that all people who have tics or Tourette's swear. That's not actually true. The number is much lower. It's around about 20 to 30%. And it can obviously be quite difficult for someone who has tics and Tourette's if they're swearing or saying something offensive. And sadly, there's an increased amount of stigma and increased amount of bullying that people who have tics and Tourette's experience. And actually, if people point out or highlight that someone is swearing, if you have tics and Tourette's, it can actually make tics kind of worse, as tics can increase with stress. Stress isn't typically a cause of tics and Tourette's, but it can kind of enhance them or make them more frequent. And sadly, this kind of stigma and bullying and some of the difficulties that people can experience as well. Some motor tics are quite painful, particularly things like stopping someone from writing, or if someone's continuously jerking their neck backwards, that can really hurt. So sometimes it can be associated with decreased quality of life. And there are some things that can be helpful to manage tics and Tourette's. Obviously, we don't want people to stop ticking, but let's say there are some things that, such as psychological therapies and medications, that can be used to help people kind of reduce tics when they want to. So let's say they were in a place of work in a meeting and they just wanted to calm their tics for a little bit, or they were giving a speech and they didn't want to be interrupted as much, then there's something called exposure response prevention, which is a therapy which can be helpful for some people. But if you're interested in looking those up, one of the websites I'll show you at the end probably has more information on that. But I think it's important, really, the point of thinking about the increased bullying and stigma, or with all these forms of neurodivergence, is that we've really got to be kind as people to the people around us, and including our children and ourselves. And, you know, just because we're different, it's not a bad thing. I've said it before and I'll say it again because it's the key message of this presentation. We really should be celebrating neurodivergent people. And obviously, with these things such as bullying and stigma, there can be increased mental health difficulties and sometimes even suicidal ideation. So I hope those kind of messages bring home why we should really be kind and support people who are neurodivergent. So in terms of tics across the lifespan, as I've said, they typically are first observed during childhood. Roughly around 1 to 2 years of age, tics might start first appearing. For some children, it might be a bit later, but they normally kind of reach their kind of peak in terms of their frequency at around 12.5 years of age. And the lines on this kind of graph are wavy, and that is because tics kind of wax and wane. And what that means is that within a month or so, or even a week, tics can kind of increase or decrease in frequency. So it could be related to what a person's doing in their life. So maybe they've got stressful life events happening, so their tics might increase, or it could just be biological differences, as we know that tics are related to kind of brain neurotransmitters, which are kind of chemicals in our brain that may be decreasing or increasing in a young person. Some people's tics might go away as they get older. Some people's tics might kind of go away slightly, but kind of still be there. Some people's tics might stay at the same level. And some people may have tics, but they may just go to a level where they don't notice them, or they may go away completely. And again, for some people, tics might come back or resurge later in life. So it's just thinking about how we support people if they are finding their tics difficult. Obviously, we don't want to eradicate people's tics. We just want to give them ways of managing them if they're finding them distressing. In terms of strengths, there are many strengths, again, associated with tics and Tourette's. Tourette's potentially including improved performance on certain memory tasks. I think there's something called procedural memory, which is something to do with, like, if you tie your shoelaces, or the memories used for sequences like that, or riding a bike, those kind of things. We use our procedural memory to do those things. And in people with tics and Tourette's, in this research, the people who had tics and Tourette's were better at kind of learning a sequence and performing it compared to people without tics and Tourette's, which was impressive. And maybe actually sometimes people have to suppress their tics and Tourette's if they're distressing, or they feel like they want to. And actually this can lead to improved cognitive control. So some researchers got people with tics and Tourette's to kind of not focus or move their eyes to certain things on a screen, and the people with tics and Tourette's were better at doing this. And surely having improved cognitive control sounds like a good thing. Tics can also be associated with enhanced creative thinking and being able to kind of perform better on what we call verbal tasks. So some researchers got people with tics and Tourette's to learn and then repeat a phrase of words or a series of words, and the people with tics and Tourette's were able to repeat these words with greater ease and with less mistakes, which I again think is very impressive. And hopefully this is shown for all these forms of neurodivergence. All these strengths can allow people to do great things. And one way that this is demonstrated is by the number of famous neurodivergent people there are in the world. So I've got here some pictures of famous neurodivergent people. You've probably heard of a few, and I'll kind of list them now. So if I get my laser pointer back, here we go. Right, so we're going to move from the left of the screen. But in the very left, right upper hand corner, we've got Mozart, the famous musician, composer, who lived in Austria, who wrote some fantastic piece of music. But it's supposed that Mozart may have had Tourette's, but he also may have had autism. Obviously, we can't confirm for certainty as he's not alive today, but some of his behaviors may indicate that. Then here we've got next to him Greta Thunberg, the famous climate activist, who's talked about how being autistic, who's kind of helped her focus in on her passion and has allowed her to kind of see the world in a different way. And if she wasn't autistic, she said in her documentary, she doesn't think she would have been able to be so passionate. And I think being passionate about saving the world is a pretty important thing to do. So I think it definitely was a strength for Greta Thunberg. Then next to Greta Thunberg here, we've got Billie Eilish, the multiple Grammy award-winning composer who's written lots of fantastic music. And Billie Eilish has been quite open about having Tourette's as well. And then next to Billie Eilish, we've got will.i.am, who was in a famous band called the Black Eyed Peas, who has ADHD. And then next to, or below will.i.am here, we've got Lewis Capaldi, who also had tics and Tourette's, and who's been, again, quite openly vocal about having tics and Tourette's. You may have watched his documentary. So then next to Lewis Capaldi, we've got Simone Biles, a very famous gymnast who won multiple gold medals in several Olympics, including the 2024 Rio Olympics, which if you're watching this video, probably happened quite recently. Again, maybe having ADHD could be allow people to be more athletic and perform better in athletic situations. As I was saying earlier, ADHD may have been an evolutionary advantage, allowing people to kind of divert their attention, maybe be more energetic, focus more on those kind of physical attributes as well. Then next to Simone Biles, we've got Einstein, one of the most famous thinkers ever, whose kind of theoretical physics ideas have inspired multiple things that still exist today and have given us a greater understanding of how the world and universe works. And then next to Albert Einstein, so Albert Einstein was potentially dyslexic, and then again for next to Albert Einstein, we've got Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, who is reported to have also been dyslexic as well. And then again on this slide, we've got many famous actors, comedians. So we've got Emma Watson from Harry Potter, who has ADHD. Richard Branson, as I talked earlier, famous entrepreneurs who were dyslexic. So we've got Richard Branson, then we've got Bill Gates, and also Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs was potentially dyslexic, or was dyslexic, and then Bill Gates had dyslexia and ADHD. Here we've also got, if you look where my laser pointer is, we've got Chris Packham, who's a conservationist and naturalist. So maybe by he reports that he's able to see nature in a different way and being able to identify plants and different species because he is autistic and can see the world differently. At the top, we've got a fantastic artist, Stephen Wiltshire, who is autistic, and he can go up in a helicopter, look at the London skyline and see it for around 30 seconds and then come home and draw the whole thing with incredible accuracy and detail from memory. We've then got Fern Brady, who's a fantastic comedian, who is autistic. And then on the bottom, we've got Jamie Oliver here, who's dyslexic. So I have included these pictures. I don't think neurodivergent people have to be famous or be in the public eye, but I just want to highlight all these amazing people who are neurodivergent, and that maybe because they are neurodivergent has allowed them to do all these amazing things. If you think about Apple with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates with Microsoft, everyone now, or most people, have an iPhone or some form of device, a computer they might use at work, or have been on a computer or had access to a computer. And it's because of these people who are neurodivergent that we have this technology in our lives. So what I'm trying to show, again, going back to that message, neurodivergent people can do amazing things if we allow them to flourish and support them. These are just some resources and books that can be helpful. Some of them are for children. So this Neurodiversity, What's That? It's a fantastic book for children. If you want to read that with your kids, The Power of Neurodiversity is also a great book. That was the one I was talking about earlier by Thomas Armstrong. And then we've got Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, which is a long book, but it details a lot about the history of autism. And kind of looks at it from a neuro affirmative or supporting a neurodiversity standpoint. We've then got this book here called Autism, Current Theory, an Introduction, I think, to Current Theory and Debate. That's by one of the researchers who works at Edinburgh University, and the other is from King's College London. And they include the voices of autistic people at the end of every chapter. It's quite a scientific book, but if you're interested in the understanding kind of the theories and behind autism, I recommend reading that. And then we've got some books in the middle by autistic people or parents of neurodivergent children. So that's Unmasked by Ellie Middleton, and then Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person as well by Kathy Wussel. And then I've also got the book here, Tic Disorders, a guide for parents and professionals. So here in the middle, we've got some kind of websites that are quite helpful. So we've got the National Autistic Society website, the Neurodiversity Celebration Week website, which looks at Neurodiversity Celebration Week in particular, but they've got resources that are helpful for parents if you're thinking of talking to your child about this, students, universities, schools, all those kind of different groups. Then we've got the ADHD Foundation, the Neurodiversity Charity website. They don't just focus on ADHD, but they focus on lots of different resources, but lots of great stuff there. And then Tourette's Action, which has lots of helpful information on tics and Tourette's, including, I think, details on how to access to webinars, or I think teaching similar to this, or more, which can be provided to give more information about tics and Tourette's. And then finally, we've got the British Dyslexia Association website as well. If you want to check any of those websites out, I really do recommend doing so. And if you want to, I've also put a list of references. So any of the research that I talked about in this presentation, I've also put here. So again, I recommend checking that out as well. But that is the end of this presentation. I would recommend now going and enjoying the rest of your day. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I said it would be around an hour. I've almost made it. It's quite a big topic, so I've tried to fit as much in as possible. If you do have or want to find out any kind of more information, check out the resources I've shared as well. But thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.